In November 1907, William James, a professor of philosophy at Harvard, received an invitation from Oxford. It came from Manchester College, now Harris Manchester, and a college of the university. But in those days, it was still an autonomous dissenting academy with a strong Unitarian character. The college asked James to give 8 lectures that dealt with what they called the religious aspect of your philosophy. But when he accepted the invitation a few days later, James said that he wanted his title to be The Present Situation in Philosophy. When he delivered the lectures the following year, they were a tremendous success. Reportedly 500 people turned up to the first one, so they had to move from Manchester Library to a bigger venue, and the principal was very pleased to report an audience far larger, I believe, than any philosophical lectures ever given before in Oxford. James sort of enjoyed himself in Oxford, although almost no one seems to have talked to him about his lectures. And he found, as he says in the letter, the dinner and lunch parties with no real familiar talk deadly tiresome. The highlight seems to have been seeking out the reclusive philosophical eminence that was F.H. Bradley, who took time to show him around Merton College. After his Oxford stay, William went to see his brother Henry, who I'm sure you've heard of, at Rye, and he was very, very excited to learn that G.K. Chesterton was staying at the inn next door. Intensely curious to see what Chesterton looked like, and much to his fastidious brother's acute dismay, William leaned a ladder against the garden wall, up which he climbs in the hope of getting a sighting. He was unsuccessful, but they did meet subsequently during the English visit and even took tea. And although, as William James reported, Chesterton merely gurgled and giggled, he apparently nevertheless came across as lovable. Well, getting a glimpse of Chesterton was irresistible, partly, no doubt, because he was enormously, legendarily obese. But rather more respectably, James had long admired him as a tremendously strong writer, he says, and true thinker, despite his mannerism of paradoxes. To say that Chesterton is great despite his paradoxes is a bit like saying that Venice is lovely despite the canals. You know, it's just absurd. But anyway, he was very, very warm about Chesterton, and especially taken by his book, Heretics. And you can certainly see why James would have liked Chesterton's exuberant, if somewhat remorseless, celebration of the ordinary world, a world unconstrained by what Chesterton called modern intellectualism. We must resist corrosive skepticism, says Chesterton. We must accept this huge, impossible universe which stares us in the face, an impossible universe only to the arid intellectual, someone like me. We shall look on the impossible grass and the skies with a strange courage, he says. He commended to his followers, this is Chesterton, the fact that every instant of conscious life is an unimaginable prodigy, precisely the kind of instinctive apprehension that was lost on one of Shaw's heretics, someone like Bernard Shaw, who, because he was equipped with an all-encompassing theory of the world, has, says Chesterton, all the time been silently comparing humanity with something which was not human. It's only the very great artists, Chesterton says, who are able to be ordinary men. Men like Shakespeare or Browning, he says. Well, no wonder James was slightly surprised that this buoyant life force of the huge, impossible universe should have merely gurgled and giggled in person. James himself, I should say, is never quite so exhausting as Chesterton to read. But the lectures he gave at Oxford were full of a vindication of ordinary worldly experience, a celebration of it, of which Chesterton would have thoroughly approved. The whole process of life, James told his Oxford audience, the whole process of life is due to life's violation of our logical axioms. Real life, he said, laughs at logic's veto. Consequently, he says, we should abandon the long tradition that emphasizes discursive thought generally as the sole avenue to truth. So where should we go instead? We should fall back, he says, on raw, unverbalized life. It is, he said, describing the sort of counter-philosophical position of which he approved, it is like the breath of the morning and the song of birds. It tells of reality itself instead of merely reiterating what dusty-minded professors have written about what other professors have thought. So, perhaps it's not so surprising that the Oxford dons were reluctant to have a chat about his lectures in which dusty-minded professors were pronounced guilty of what James called in a robust Chestertonian spirit, the vice of intellectualism. They might very well have thought it was not quite the right tone. But that bracing note of evangelism, that strange courage, in Chesterton's words, is a vital part of James's performance. James knew he was saying the tactless thing, but there was much at stake. The most practical and important thing about a man is his view of the universe, said Chesterton. And those are words that James had quoted approvingly on the opening page of his earlier book called Pragmatism. So this isn't really a philosophical argument about ontological rigor or philosophical reasoning. It's really about well-being. One of the highest terms of approval in James's vocabulary was healthy-mindedness. What are the ideas that we need to bring to our lives and our experience that will make us healthier or less healthy? So then, what was the present situation in philosophy that James elected to talk about? Well, two things about it were most striking. First, it had to change, and there were promising signs that it was about to. And second, that almost everything that was wrong with it was largely down to Oxford. And most especially to the kindly F.H. Bradley, who'd shown him round Merton College. So I think Bradley comes out of this rather well, given the vigor of James's attack upon him in the lectures. The philosophy of which James wished to see the back of was in origin Hegelian, absolute idealism, and therefore a version of what James calls monism. So monism, in James's formulation, depicts what he calls a co-implicated through and through world, a world which is one great all-inclusive fact outside of which is nothing. Nothing is its only alternative. What feels to you and me like the diverse life of our experience is only an appearance, beyond which we can just about, if we read F.H. Bradley, intuit the unity that is really all that matters. And this is indeed absolutely the world of Bradley. James thought that Bradley was the pattern champion of this philosophy in extremis. And it's true, Bradley is always saying things like, the universe is one, in this sense that its differences exist harmoniously within one whole, beyond which there is nothing. It is to this monistic view, the view that the world is not really real if it's not regarded in what James calls its all form, that James opposes his own view, which he calls the pluralistic view. Finally, I hear you cry, pluralism. If the monist, boo, if the monist committed to allness, oneness, totality, conceives of the world as real only insofar as it is an absolute unity, then the pluralist, by contrast, is willing to believe, in James's words, that there may ultimately never be an all form at all, that the substance of reality may never get totally collected. In short, in the pluralist view of things, all you ever have, or could want to have, is not the all form, the totalitizing kind of all form, but what James calls the each form, which is, he says, our human way of experiencing the world. Can a plurality of reals be possible, asks Mr. Bradley, and answers, no, impossible. He shows, says James, an intolerance to pluralism so extreme that I fancy few of his readers have been able fully to share it. James published those lectures the following year under the title A Pluralistic Universe. Of course, he's quite conscious, giving the book that title, that to call such an explicitly multifarious place a universe with the implication of something unitary to it is something of a paradox. He's happy, in fact, himself to call it a multiverse. But he still thinks that its multiplicity possesses a kind of rough and ready, cohesive life, so that, as he puts it, each part hangs together with its very next neighbor in inextricable interfusion, in what he calls a strung-along type of connection. Such a strung-along universe would certainly not have satisfied Mr. Bradley of Merton. What on earth did they talk about as they were going around the college and pointing out the chapel and all the rest of it? William James is says William Connolly, good phrase, the philosophy of a messy universe. Bradley wants a tidy universe. James is happy with a messy universe. His critics have often thought of William James as more of a literary than a philosophical figure, which is not a distinction that I think would trouble him at all. One of his biographers duly remarks that his feeling for and intuition about the infinite variety of the world showed what the biographer calls the sensibility of a poet. But it's more useful, I think, to say that it's a particular kind of sensibility that's at stake. And the sensibility in question that I'm going to talk about for the next few minutes is the literary companion of that immense 19th century transformation in attitudes that Isaiah Berlin spent so much of his genius explicating and, on the whole, celebrating, the movement in Western thought that he characterized as Romanticism. So modern poet in my title is romantic and after. Put simply, the Romantics turned upside down, says Berlin, the centuries-old belief that one is good, many, diversity is bad. Diversity, as Berlin characterizes this immense shift in human thought, diversity, the plurality of things, becomes the new good. Well, it's in these terms a romantic sensibility that, say, Chesterton revered in Browning, that great poet who you remember from a few minutes ago also managed to be an ordinary man as well as a genius. Browning was full, said paradoxical Chesterton, of the glory of the obvious. He becomes eccentric, said Chesterton, through his advocacy of the ordinary, an advocacy that expresses itself in his singular vitality, curiosity, and interest in details. These are all the virtues of the pluralistic genius. If, Chesterton speculated, you had asked Browning, is life worth living? And asked him to give the real, vital answer that awaited it in his own soul, then Browning would have said, as likely as not, says Chesterton, crimson toadstools in Hampshire. He sounds absolutely bonkers, I know, but he's thinking of some particular lines in a Browning poem, By the Fireside. By the rose-flesh mushrooms undivulged last evening, nay, in today's first dew, yon sudden coral nipple bulged, where a freak fawn-coloured flaky crew of toadstools peeped, indulged. That would seem a very good instance of what James calls an each form. Browning doesn't think the toadstools stand for anything or symbolize anything, let alone the totality of the one. What matters is merely that they are one of what Chesterton calls the great concrete experiences. What's so good about Browning's toadstools, it seems to me, is how excessive they are to requirements. They seem, as we might say, to require a sudden life of their own within the poem. And this quality of unruliness is something that, in his own terms, William James cherishes too. Sensible reality, he says, sensible reality, that's to say the reality of the senses, sensible reality is too concrete to be entirely manageable. One of the most deft moves in a pluralistic universe is the observation on James's part that the Oxford idealists often surprised within themselves a diversity which they had not expected and for which they could not, except in the most abstract and formal way, find any sort of home. Something like pluralism breaks out, as James puts it. It is as if, he says in one of his most inspired analogies, it is as if the characters in a novel were to get up from the pages and walk away and transact business of their own outside the author's story. You might think there is no higher praise you could give to a novelist than to say that he or she had created characters with a life of their own. But crediting things with a life of their own was precisely what, in James's reading, the Oxford idealist philosophers were disinclined to do. Still, as he ventured to hope, times were changing. And we might perhaps see his hopeful trend exemplified a few years later in the young Louis MacNeice. MacNeice studied philosophy under a pupil of F.H. Bradley and in F.H. Bradley's college, Merton, and spent part of one summer vacation ploughing through the required reading while staying in the south of France. And this is how MacNeice wonderfully remembers it in later years. I was very fond of Bradley's dictum that every judgment is a judgment about the universe, because everything is about the one. Yes, there's no particularity that constitutes reality, really. Everything is about the one. It was exciting when I said I liked aubergines to be saying something true about the universe, and moreover, to be adding something to it. Still, it did not help me to understand the Provençal woman who had cooked the aubergine, and who, after all, was in the universe too. MacNeice remembers his tutors telling him that the man in the street, a naive realist, never can see the wood for the trees. Yes, so naive realists like, I suppose, you and me, we just see the particularity of experience and we don't get any sense of the oneness that actually lies behind it and underwrites it all. We never can see the wood for the trees. I never thought, MacNeice reflected, that I should be telling them vice versa, that they can't see the trees for the wood. It's the trees that matter. MacNeice, who spoke so witheringly of what he called theory vendors, would naturally have found much to like in James's account of a world which exceeds any general account that we can offer of it. Something always escapes, James says. That's almost the most important phrase in the entire book. Whatever account we can offer of the world, theory of the world, something always escapes. It's never going to be a complete and total theory. In famous lines from MacNeice's poem, Snow, world is crazier and more of it than we think, incorrigibly plural. I peel and portion a tangerine and spit the pips and feel the drunkenness of things being various. very bad Merton boy. This is exactly what you're not meant to think if you've done philosophy at Merton. James says that philosophy, as generally understood, begins with the urge to correct that aboriginal appearance of things by which savages are not troubled. So philosophy is a kind of corrective mode to try and restrain or somehow contain the variousness of savage life. But MacNeice, as you see, is perfectly happy for things to be uncorrected, to be incorrigible. As much as the tangerine and its pips, the Provençal woman, and indeed her aubergine, happily exemplifies what Auden, MacNeice's great friend, would much later call the happy eachness of all things, such as crimson toadstools in Hampshire. And it applies to us too. We are each a unique particular, Auden says in his poem, The Double Man, the poem in which he also envisages, in a totally Jamesian spirit, life as a place of what he calls pluralistic interstices. Much good may your one and only do you, said the undergraduate MacNeice in a student magazine, but we shall play with our coloured bricks forever. Of course, discovering a tenacious sort of pluralism where you had looked to find oneness, or you'd been trained to look to find oneness or unity, could be a less simply celebratory experience than MacNeice found it. I don't want to claim that everyone took enthusiastically to the new Jamesian multiverse. The young T.S. Eliot, for example, a little bit before MacNeice, another student, a much more advanced student of F.H. Bradley, was dismayed to find, rather as James had observed, that Bradley's final achievement was, paradoxically, to advertise the pluralism of the world which he had sought monistically to correct. The world had proved, Eliot thought, in Bradley's philosophy, incorrigibly plural. Upon inspection, Eliot says, of Bradley's universe, writing rather wonderfully in a journal called The Monist, it falls away into the isolated, finite experiences out of which it is put together. And the Bradleyan oneness, pretending to be something that, I'm quoting Eliot here, pretending to be something which makes finite centres cohere, turns out to be merely the assertion that they do. So Bradley, in a very brilliant way in Eliot's reading, turns out to be a pluralist, as it were, despite himself. As it were, so alert to the pluralism that he wishes to correct, that the lasting message of his writing is the vividness and the reality of that pluralism, and not the correction that he wishes to impose upon it. Well, the subject matter of these utterances is obviously a long way away from what normally gets into poems, but I don't think that critics like Hugh Kenner, for example, or Piers Gray are misguided in making connections or drawing analogies between Bradleyan wholes falling into their isolated components and the striking experiments with poetic form that Eliot will go on to conduct, especially in his masterpiece, as I take it, The Wasteland. The Wasteland, I hasten to reassure you, is not a poem about absolute idealism, thank goodness, but still that curious sense of metaphysical nostalgia which haunts the poem's broken forms must have some relationship, I think, to what Eliot called the melancholy grace, the languid mastery that Eliot found in Bradley, a kind of the broken monist. The poem feels like it inhabits and depicts a world which lacks the saving authority of a justification, of a something that underwrites it. And in this, of course, in a very approximate way, it's rather like the yearning for a solving unity that shapes the needy monist. And this unhappily pluralist feeling can get in the poem in all sorts of ways. When lovely woman stoops to folly and paces about her room again alone. She smooths her hair with automatic hand and puts a record on the gramophone. The brilliant, poignant disjunction of these lines comes from their not managing to be some other lines which they might have been in a different world, lines to which Eliot draws our attention, lines from Goldsmith. These lines appear in The Vicar of Wakefield in a chapter entitled appropriately, Fresh Calamities. When lovely woman stoops to folly and finds too late that men betray, what charm can soothe her melancholy? What art can wash her guilt away? So, as often with the allusions in this great poem, this is a dramatized act of misremembering. And here, as elsewhere, the misremembering works to suggest that something is fundamentally wrong, something here connected in odd ways with the automatism of the woman and the machinery of the record player, the way that her hand is automatic and in some senses mirrors the arm of the record player. Eliot is interested in these moments of illusion in the wasteland in a culture that can't hear itself properly. So Goldsmith is there, but you're not getting him quite right. He's somehow out of tune with what he really is. Christopher Ricks describes the technique, this elusive technique I'm talking about, as conveying by sabotage that there's a war on. And he takes this Goldsmith allusion in the wasteland as a prime example. Eliot, he says, is seen to be adopting Oliver Goldsmith's line and then undoing it by adding the innocuous little word, and. So, when lovely woman stoops to folly, and, not when lovely woman stoops to folly. The little word undoes the old rhyme of the original and the rhythm too, scuppers that. It takes a 4-beat line and turns it into a 5-beat line. More, it leaves the little word at the end of the line isolated, as though in sympathy with the solitary woman he's talking about. End of a line where it has no business, and thereby placing upon it a kind of unexpected emphasis. And is a conjunction, grammatically speaking. So I suppose one might think it's there with this unusual emphasis in such an awkward position because it's part of a passage that describes a sad disjunction between people. The typist he is writing about and the house clerk have had sex, but there's been no real conjunction of any kind at all. Remember, the friar inquires at the aborted wedding service in Much Ado About Nothing, is there any inward impediment why you should not be conjoined? Well, the wasteland's all about inward impediments, why people cannot be conjoined. So you can see why Eliot might have been particularly alert to the resonance of a word in English which is preeminently a conjunction, the word and. Well, okay, that was me channeling the spirit of Christopher Ricks for a few minutes there. I nurse another thought, though, as well, and I admit that's why I chose that passage from The Wasteland in the first place. The word and is a hallmark pluralist word. And that's not just my fancy. That's what William James says in the last lecture, which was the lecture he is most proud of, in a pluralistic universe. The word and, says James, trails along after every sentence. Because if the world is untheorizable and there's always something else to say, then whenever you've said whatever you can say about it, there's always another thing that you can say. And that next thing begins with the word and. And he might have added, every sentence effectively begins with an and as well. And you remember, for example, the wonderful opening lines of Pound's cantos, and then went down to the show. So you're immediately joining a fluency of life that has already begun before you've joined it. Well, in the only essay about the word "and" that I could find, you will be relieved to know, a piece by the novelist William H. Gass, he says this: if we were suddenly to speak of the andness of things, we would be rather readily understood to refer to that aspect of life which consists of just one damned thing and after another. And the opening of Matthew Arnold's Dover Beach seems to me an and poetry of this kind. Listen, you hear the grating roar of pebbles which the waves draw back and fling at their return up the high strand, begin and cease, and then again begin with tremulous cadence slow, and bring the eternal note of sadness in. And now, this is absolutely, I should confess to you, geared, as it were, for an undergraduate lecture, but anyway, here we go. This is what John Masefield calls ODTAR, an acronym, one damn thing after another. It's the title of a novel that Masefield writes, which really does, I must say to you, I've read it on your behalf. You don't have to read it now. And it really does live up to what it says on the tin. It is a long tale of utterly futile adventures in the jungle, event after event, as Masefield says, which ends up achieving precisely nothing. And something of that feeling, I think, is to be found in Eliot's lines and in Arnold's lines too. Arnold's word for the plurality, this endlessness that he deplores and troubles him, is anarchy. Eliot's is chaos, but they're talking about very much a similar thing. However, as William Gass says in that essay, the general form of the word "and" is what he says, a simple next. For Eliot's sad typist in The Wasteland, it's an ominous and defeated what next? When a lovely woman stoops to folly, and if you listen to Eliot reading it, it's a wonderful recording of him reading The Wasteland, and you can see that Eliot wants the emphasis upon it. He said, when lovely woman stoops to folly, and he wants you to think about and. What next? So for her, it's a bit like Dorothy Parker, that wonderful sad story about Dorothy Parker, knock on the door. What fresh hell can this be? That's the what next, isn't it, that's happening there. But of course, William James's ever-present and can be jubilant and a marker of the inexhaustibility of the world. And of course, that's what James himself conveys. Well, as you might expect, Browning, the genius who also happens to be an ordinary man, Browning loves and. Here he is writing to Elizabeth Barrett about the splendors of the Dulwich Picture Gallery. Those two Guidos, the wonderful Rembrandt of Jacob's Vision, such a Watteau, the triumphant three Murillo pictures, a Giorgione music lesson group, all the Poussins with the Armida and Jupiter's nursing, and no end to ands. And here is the voice of Aprilie, a poet figure from Browning's early drama Paracelsus, who is detailing his hectically creative plans. So he says, I create a world, I'm going to do the same undergraduate trick. So I create a world for these my shapes fit to sustain their beauty and their strength. And at the word I would contrive and paint woods, valleys, rocks and plains, dells, sands and wastes, lakes and so on. Tremendous kind of a multiplicity of invention. I've done something a little bit naughty, as I did in the Matthew Arnold too. So there's an and buried in sand, just as there's an and buried in strand in the Arnold lines that I was talking to you about. But I think, once you are, as it were, sensitized to the andness of things, you begin to see it in these words that aren't required. They are choices that the poet has made to put into their verse. I would throw down the pencil as the chisel, and I would speak, and he would too. As we might also expect, MacNeice, the laureate of incorrigible plurality, was also a master of and in particular his long poem about living through the later 30s, Autumn Journal, is a great epic of and. So this is from the first page, but you could dip anywhere into Autumn Journal and find andness all over the place. Macrocarpa and cypress and roses on a rustic trellis and mulberry trees and bacon and eggs in a silver dish for breakfast and all the inherited assets of bodily ease and all the inherited worries, rheumatism and taxes and whether Stella will marry and what to do with Dick and the branch of the family that lost their money and hatchery and the passing of the Morning Post and of life's climacteric. And the growth of vulgarity, cars that pass the gate lodge and crowds undressing on the beach, and the hiking cockney lovers with thoughts directed neither to God nor nation, but, Jamesian words, each to each. And something of the same quality of sheer plenitude, it seems to me, gets into Tom Gunn's wonderful portrait of his dog running around excitedly on the beach. Joy, joy, being outside with you, active, investigating it all with bowels emptied, feeling your approval, and then running on, the big fleet Yoko. My body in its excellent black coat never lets me down, returning to you as I always will, you know that, and now filling myself out with myself, no longer confused. Well, there are only two ands there, but I still think they are the organizing words of all that. Tom Gunn was capable of extraordinarily elaborate bits of syntactical engineering, but this is deliberately, syntactically, completely uninteresting, isn't it? All he's interested in doing is evoking the sequential, inconsequential representation of disorganized animal experience, what James calls raw, unverbalized life. As Michael Longley, great Northern Irish poet, said, and is one of the most poetic words in any language, he says. It dominates and it insinuates. It separates and joins. Well, this poetry of pluralism has many virtues, but I am not sure that structure or organization are likely to be among them. Virginia Woolf wondered at their absence in Autumn Journal and put it down to MacNeice watching too many films. Eliot's uneasiness about pluralism is like Arnold's uneasiness about order, and he associated its modern form with the kind of politics of which he, Eliot, did not approve, namely what he calls the chaos of liberal democracy. James, too, made a connection between pluralism and politics. The pluralistic world is, says James, more like a federal republic than an empire or a kingdom. It's the philosophy of a new world. An old-styled empire or kingdom has, I suppose, a centralized structure of power within which live its subjects. In a federal republic, by contrast, power is distributed, and its people, while citizens of a single nation, are also inhabitants of a multiplicity of separate states. He's thinking about the United States as a model of a federal republic. Each of those states has a life of its own. Now, order is traditionally a poetic virtue. The maker's rage to order words of the sea, as Wallace Stevens says. But a poetry that emulates the pluralistic federal republican, the democratic virtues, whatever other benefits it might have, could not feel that it has order on its side, exactly. Well, certainly W.H. Auden thought not. A poem which is really like a political democracy, examples unfortunately exist, would be formless, windy, banal, and utterly boring. It's very naughty of Auden to say that examples exist and not to say what they were, but I think what he means is Whitman. And I think it would be fair enough to associate Whitman with Emerson's grand claim that America is a poem in our eyes, but it's a poem of a Whitmalian kind. It's not in stanza forms, it's roaming, expanding, potentially unending, free verse. James, interestingly, would not have demurred from that political analogy. He said himself, the pluralistic empiricism which I profess offers but a sorry appearance. So he thinks that pluralism gives you all sorts of things, but it's not going to give you beauty. What is the pluralistic universe that he describes? He says it's a turbid, muddled, Gothic sort of affair, without a sweeping outline and with little pictorial nobility. But then conversely, as Auden says, a society which really was like a good poem, embodying the aesthetic virtues of beauty, order, economy, and subordination of detail to the whole, would be a nightmare of horror, for giving the historical reality of actual men. Such a society could only come into being through selective breeding, extermination of the physically and mentally unfit, absolute obedience to its director, and a large slave class kept out of sight in cellars. In other words, Nazism. So Walter Benjamin's famous argument about fascism being aestheticized politics is what Auden is talking about there. So we seem to have arrived at an either-or, good poems or pluralism. But do poets really have to leave their pluralism in the locker when they sit down to write their verses? I think there might be, as you can tell, this is the last bit, the last third, as it were. I think there might be a more interesting account of the relationship that can exist between poetry and pluralism than Auden's rather tendentious antithesis of rival virtues. And this, as I say, the final step in my lecture, brings me back to Isaiah Berlin, and that second consequence of his pluralist thinking that I mentioned. So bear with me for a moment while I set out the background to that. Berlin, I am sure, accepted the reality of the diverse, phenomenal world in which we live. I think the idea of not doing so never crossed his mind as something that it was worth thinking about. His appeal was always to what he called the ordinary resources of empirical observation and ordinary human knowledge. So in that sense, a Chestertonian appeal to the ordinary. But his interest in that spectacle lay somewhere slightly other than the sheer Jamesian fact of things being plural. Berlin's interest was rather in the plurality of morals, or rather of values, because a value could be non-moral. In the fact that, as Berlin says, we are faced with choices between ends equally ultimate and claims equally ultimate, the realization of some of which must inevitably involve the sacrifice of others. So this is to experience the innate multifariousness of things, okay, absolutely, but now it's within the life of the mind and the life of one's moral and ethical duties. And what we discover through introspection is that there are diverse values, each admirable, and they often contradict each other. Doing what a favorite example in the literature, doing what the call of liberty would require, for example, might not be to do what the call of equality would prefer, and so on. So these are things that are incorrigibly plural, all right. Some philosophers, some political theorists think that that's a good thing in itself. And of course, Berlin championed pluralism and thought that monism was a terrible thing that led to fascism, unless you were careful. But plurality itself is clearly not something simply to celebrate. The necessity of choosing between absolute claims, says Berlin, is an inescapable characteristic of the human condition, and therefore the possibility of conflict and of tragedy can never wholly be eliminated from human life. We are faced with conflicting values, he says elsewhere. The dogma that they must somehow, somewhere be reconcilable is a mere pious hope. Experience shows that's false. So, faced with this plurality of values, how do we choose? Well, there is, as you can imagine, and as I've been reading for the last 6 months, a vast literature of political theory that tries to answer that question, and much of it, hopefully, if not piously, invokes things like political reason or a spirit of reasonable compromise or the discovery of a surprising amount of common ground, if you look at it, and things like that. And Berlin also was happy to say that you could certainly proceed in a reasonable sort of way with these impossible pluralistic dilemmas. But in truth, if, like Berlin, you believe these diverse values are genuinely, to use his word, incommensurable, then it's very hard to see how you actually could judiciously compare them one with another in a rational way. By definition, they have nothing in common. Trying to weigh up, say, the rival claims of liberty and equality in any particular situation would be like trying to assess the comparative merits of a sunset and a daffodil. They're just different things. Faced with such a plurality of values, as Bernard Williams says, no conflict of values can ever rationally be resolved. And that's quite a big outcome, isn't it, for the moral life, if that's really where pluralism takes us. Reason will never actually help us through to the resolution of these sorts of problems. Berlin was a brilliantly effervescent and life-affirming figure, but the consequences of his pluralism can seem pretty dark. We are doomed to choose, he says, doomed to choose, and every choice may entail an irreparable loss. Part of the fascination of pluralism to me is this extraordinary emotional range that it has. Berlin's pluralism, edged with tragic feeling, is utterly unlike the ebullient multifariousness of William James's pluralistic universe. Pluralism for Berlin and his followers and all those who write in his aftermath, for all the values of not being monism, it's become a problem. And Berlin does not underestimate the precariousness of the sorts of decision which are the only ones that are in real life possible. It's all a matter, says Berlin, of promoting and preserving an uneasy equilibrium between these rival values, one which is, as in his words, constantly threatened and in constant need of repair. And Bernard Williams, his best commentator, I think, puts it even more starkly. We have no coherent conception of a world without loss, says Williams. And that's a consequence of the pluralism of that world, a world full of necessarily unrealized possibilities. So every moral decision that we take is a way of incurring loss. Now, of course, Berlin was a political philosopher, but in a way, as Williams astutely remarks, his real interest was not in politics, but in personalities. The tension between conflicting values in one consciousness. That's what Berlin was really excited by. And from that perspective, I'm struck by a phrase in Berlin's great book about liberty, in which he refers to, quote, the moral or emotional or intellectual collisions, the particular kind of acute mental discomfort, which rises to a condition of agony, from which great works of the human intellect and imagination have sprung. What might this pluralist agony have to do with works of imagination? Berlin was a deeply literary person and was, I think, keenly responsive to the literary thinking of his time. 4 essays on liberty, I suppose his masterpiece, is actually dedicated to Stephen Spender. But it's William Empson whom I want to turn to here as a literary context for Berlin's pluralism, acknowledging here a very, very good essay by Mark Thompson on this subject. In a book published in 1951, while discussing the theories of I.A. Richards, Empson says, it may be that the human mind can recognize actually incommensurable values, so a Berlinish vocabulary, though before Berlin has used it, it should be said, and that the chief human value is to stand up between them. So to stand up between them is not exactly to harmonize or reconcile or resolve those plural values, but somehow to keep yourself upright while remaining cognizant of both. It's very much in the spirit of Berlin's unsteady balancing act and speaks to something that the young Empson had wonderfully written years before, that life involves maintaining oneself between contradictions that can't be solved by analysis. Empson was evidently not deterred by the inadequacy of analytical reason to arrive at a solution, whether or not, he says, something he writes about at the same time, whether or not the values open to us are measurable, we cannot measure them, and it is of much value merely to stand up between the forces to which we are exposed. This sort of inner conflict, this acute mental discomfort of which Berlin speaks, could push you over the edge. But there may be something to hand, not a solution, but something perhaps more therapeutic. Poetry. The effort of writing a good bit of verse, says Empson, has in almost every case been carried through almost as a clinical thing. It was done only to save the man's own sanity. Or, as he puts the same point in a later letter, poetry is insincere unless it is clinical, resolving conflicts in the author and thus preventing him from going mad. Auden, in his less categorical moments, would have thoroughly agreed that poetry could emerge from the difficult pluralist experience of a diversity of goods. Art arises, says Auden at one point, art arises out of our desire for both beauty and truth. He's thinking of Keats's Grecian urn. Arises out of our desire for both beauty and truth and our knowledge that they are not identical. So art it emerges out of a pluralistic crisis. We want things two ways. Analysis says we cannot have them. But for a moment, a poem lets us, in a way that discursive prose, for instance, cannot. I do not say that this is all poetry can do. I think poems can do all sorts of things. But I think that some poems can be seen to articulate these tensions of pluralisms in just the way that Empson suggests, taps into a kind of Berlin kind of thinking about plurality. And let me briefly give you, I'm coming to a close now, an example to end with. Keith Douglas's very fine poem called Vergiss mich nicht was written while he was fighting in North Africa in the Second War. It describes the abandoned enemy tank, which Douglas's platoon had hit 3 weeks before. The body of the German soldier was still lying there, now decaying. And Douglas notices left in the tank a photograph of the dead man's girlfriend, on which he has written, Vergiss mich nicht, forget me not. We see him almost with content, abased and seeming to have paid and mocked at by his own equipment that's hard and good when he's decayed. But she would weep to see today how on his skin the swart flies move, the dust upon the paper eye and the burst stomach, like a cave. For here the lover and killer are mingled, who had one body and one heart, and death, who had the soldier singled, has done the lover mortal hurt. If you said this was an anti-war poem, you would be quite wrong. You don't need to read Douglas's letters to twig that he was deeply committed to fighting the Germans. He thought it was the right thing to do. And anyway, he relished military life. The poem's greatness, it seems to me, is to hold the genuine value of that necessarily ugly enterprise against the loveliness of the picture of the girl and all that it symbolizes, to which Douglas is no less attuned. Two quite distinct worlds of judgment are held within the moment of the poem in what Berlin might call a precarious balance. It's a wonderful example, it seems to me, of what Auden calls the pluralist interstices. Thank you.
Thank you, Seamus. That was absolutely wonderful. We have 20 minutes or so for questions. I'll start with one while you decide whether to raise your hand or not. The discussion of "and" made me think of the King James Bible and the particular long shadow that it casts over the English language, and the way that so many sentences in the King James Bible begin with "and," because of, as I understand it, a kind of curiosity of translation where various conjunctions are translated as "and" instead of "but" or "then" or whatever. I wonder how the way in which so much poetry that uses "and" is evoking that particular cadence, and the way that the King James Bible occupies quite a particular political superstructure, let's say, impact upon the characterization of "and" in English poetry. Because that's certainly, that's what I hear in MacNeice, for example.
A biblical register, as it were, yes. Ironized, presumably. Yeah. I hadn't thought about the King James Bible, and I'm not going to try and say that the King James Bible is a masterpiece of pluralist literature. I'm sure you're right that there are resonances like that in 20th century poetry, and I suspect that rather like MacNeice, they are probably ironical, I would guess. It strikes me, for example, that Dylan Thomas poem. Do you remember? And death shall have no dominion. Whereas actually, as it were, the tag is death shall have no dominion. But Thomas wants to begin his poem saying, and death shall have no dominion, which I think, I don't know, it partly adds a kind of, I don't know, clerical orotundity to the whole thing, while at the same time kind of undermining somehow something else about death. It's going to have no, if you see what I mean. I don't have a very good answer to your question, I'm afraid.
That's fine. Hopefully you'll have better answers to the people who have questions. We have 2 raving mics, I think. Do we have a raised hand anywhere? Apparently there's one at the back. I really can't see because the lights are quite bright. But if you could head towards that raised hand.
Yes, thank you. I have a question about other aesthetic forms, whether they can also sort of hold this pluralist contradictions. I'm thinking particularly about music.
Yeah, well, yes, music's difficult, I suppose. I mean, Sam knows more about music than I do, but music's difficult, I suppose, because it's not propositional in a sense, is it? It doesn't really have an obvious sort of semantic force. But I'm sure if Auden were here, he would be able to improvise a dazzling answer about the way in which certain kinds of contrapuntal form in Bach, for example, weaves together different things.
Well, I guess it's that sort of inherent polyphony.
Yeah.
It means that multiple voices are in constant dialogue. That's sort of the definition of it.
Yeah.
Does it fulfill something?
Polyphony is, I suppose, it's diversity, but in check, isn't it? Because it's very much under control. Maybe I'm just wading into territory where I just don't know what I'm talking about. But maybe, as it were, a Messiaen symphony, that's perhaps a diversity, as it were, gone crazy.
I can see the hands better now. There's another one in more or less the same place.
Thank you so much. That was brilliant. I have a question to you about what would you say the different historical conditions are for monism and pluralism? Obviously, they're in dialogue, in conversation, but they have different momentum at different times. And obviously, the Douglas poems are war poems. So, what would you say the contexts are that give them the philosophies different weight and throw?
Yes, it's a very good question. I haven't read anything that relates. Not to say it doesn't exist. It's just my ignorance. I haven't read anything that relates the trends in British philosophy, for example, to social history or socioeconomic conditions. It is very, very interesting that for the second half of the 19th century, absolutely the dominant trend in English philosophy was what William James was against. It was a kind of a monist, idealist, Hegelian philosophy, but it doesn't have a consistent political viewpoint. I mean, I think Bradley's politics were probably quite conservative, but someone like T.H. Green at Balliol adopts exactly the same idealistic monist philosophy, and his politics are extraordinarily, progressive and liberal. So there's not an easy, as it were, historical explanation, I don't think, as to why different philosophical schools came to prominence at different times. I do think that that in a sense the Berlinian representation of Romanticism that I gave you in that talk is fantastically misleading, because although it's true that a lot of Romantic thought was absolutely passionately committed to diversitarianism, there was equally vast amounts of Romantic thought that was committed to various kinds of holism and Unitarian kind of totality, as it were. So I think a more complicated version of this talk, which came from a different position, would see the different elements that are working their way through as both inheritances of whatever it was that happened in the Romantic period. And why Romanticism happened, goodness knows.
There's in the middle aisle, if you could come around, thank you. Just sort of about halfway down.
Thank you so much for your talk. I was wondering about the position of and as a conjunction, as an extrinsic structure. And I was thinking about what you might have to say about intrinsic plurality. So as an example from science, two people look at the same data but interpret it differently.
I can't say anything of any interest about the scientific point, other than to say that when Empson talks about things being incommensurable, what that shows is that he did maths as part one in the Tripos in Cambridge. Incommensurability, as a great friend of mine, colleague of mine at Balliol called Tom Mellon explained to me, is an absolutely central mathematical concept. It's in Euclid and so on. A measure like the side of a triangle or something like that is commensurable if you can divide it into two integers, into two whole figures. But if you can't, then it's incommensurable. And that's where Empson gets that metaphor of incommensurability. Where Berlin gets it from, I simply don't know. I don't think Berlin had any mathematical training of any kind. I think, very, very broadly speaking, the relationship with science in this whole debate is really fascinating, and it's something that I would like to know more about, because obviously the idea of uncertainty and things like that are becoming very important scientific concepts at exactly the same time that these people are doing the things that they're doing. So you don't know whether an electron is here or an electron is there, as it were. And that obviously has a kind of analogy to the imponderability of, the sort of thing that Stoppard writes plays about. Yes, the kinds of moral indecisiveness that the people I'm writing about are talking about, are writing about. Sorry, it's not a very good answer to your question.
I discovered today, Seamus, that you were originally going to study medicine. which is something I never knew before.
Where'd you find that out from?
It was on the Balliol announcement.
Oh, okay, right.
I was wondering, is there something behind this lecture that you don't address directly? There's a cliche that I was thinking of at various points, the idea that politicians campaign in poetry and govern in prose. And the idea of pluralist, liberal democracy and poetry, I suppose the most recent actual political example might be a figure like Obama, who I guess embodies certain aspects of the politics you're describing within a particular poetic register, and who is sort of widely regarded now as having been some kind of dead end. There was something about the connection between politics and poetry, as expressed through the compromises of Obama's politics, that have to some extent given rise to this sort of slight thing that you hinted at of, in the present, seemingly the fascists having the best tunes as far as the campaigning is concerned. Is there a sense of present politics behind what you're talking about here that you could address directly, or is it this sort of feeling that somehow political liberalism of the kind that you clearly sympathise with isn't finding an articulation of itself that means that it can flourish as a form of politics in the present?
Wow. I am a passionate supporter of Nigel Farage, I should say. No. I don't know quite how to go about that. I've read a lot of political theory in the last two months, most of which didn't get into the lecture. But it's interesting how you're right, how extraordinarily embattled liberalism is. Even talking to students and the virtues of liberalism as Berlin advocated them. So things like plurality, but plurality matters mostly because it's a sign of a healthy political body. It means that you have a political body that is determined or influenced largely by an instinct of toleration, which I take to be the absolutely central liberal political value. And I think toleration's on the way out. There was an opinion poll that was released the other day amongst current undergraduate students, and it said, do you think there are political parties who should not be allowed to speak on university campuses? And something like, I'm going to get the figure wrong, so don't quote me, but something like 2/3 of the students asked said that reform should not be allowed to speak on a university campus. Now, I don't agree with reform remotely, but the idea that somehow they should not be allowed to speak on a university campus, it seems to be appalling. And I don't think that would have been the response to a questionnaire amongst students when I was an undergraduate in the 1980s. So I think something is happening about toleration, which is a problem. How that fits into our aesthetics, how our poetry, I don't know. It seems to me, a great modern genius like Seamus Heaney would seem to me in his poetry not only to have a wonderful kind of Wordsworthian openness to experience and moments within experience, but also to embody in all sorts of wonderful ways within his imagination a kind of toleration. And I think that's what you get in lots and lots of great romantic and 19th century poems. I mean, Browning, for example, is absolutely full of a liberal spirit of toleration. It's all about trying to imagine what other people are like. And Empson's got a wonderful phrase where he says the whole point about literature is to try and imagine people who are different from us, and to construct the flying buttresses of sympathy that will connect us to them without us necessarily having to approve or endorse what it is that they believe or what they say. And I think that is a great thing that poetry could do to try and reinforce a bit of confidence in liberalism that otherwise it seems to be lacking a bit at the moment.
I think we have time for probably one or two more questions. There's one right here in the front row, and then one just behind from those two.
Thank you, that was wonderful. I want to bring it back to poetry. All the poets you talked about have, I don't want to call it smoothness, but their form is brilliant. And so with this precarious balance business, there's no question but that they're going to make a balance and they're going to unify it. Yeah. So there's a kind of unifying force in the way they use the form. So how about kind of rougher poets, somebody like Basil Bunting or Pound himself? How would that go? Because sometimes precariousness makes you seasick.
Yeah, no, that's a very good question. Well, I think the entire modern poetic tradition from the Romantics onwards, from the late 18th century onwards, is fascinated by the idea of things being fragmentary or things being incomplete. And I think that sense of incompleteness maybe speaks to what you're talking about. That there are certain kinds of balances that you can't pull off. Yeah, so I mean, in a way, a lot of this goes back. This is as it were a Donish point, but a lot of this goes back from Empson responding to his old tutor I.A. Richards, and I.A. Richards responding all the way back to Coleridge in the beginning of the 19th century. And Coleridge says that the imagination reveals itself in the balance and reconciliation of opposite and discordant qualities. And one of the great things about Coleridge's own poetry is that actually what it shows is that sometimes you can't pull off the balance. So you write Kubla Khan, which is one of the greatest poems in the English language, but you offer it to the world as a fragment because you haven't actually been able to pull it off. The imagination's task has not been completed, and the irreconcilable conflicts that you want to kind of gather together and synthesize, you just can't do it. So, I mean, a lot of modern poetry is about failure, isn't it? And I think that's in a way speaking to the issue that you're bringing up. Is Ezra Pound, the cantos in the last funny little stubby canto, he says it's all, I haven't been able to do it. It's all been a failure. And someone like Beckett, everything that Beckett writes has implicitly in brackets at the end of it, that's no good. I failed again. Well, he says it again himself, doesn't he? Fail again, fail better. That's the best you can do. So I think it's a very good point. Yeah.
There's a question just behind. Thank you.
That was really lovely. And one of the things I liked the most was the undergraduate part, where you're showing us all the ands. And I was particularly thinking about when you said, oh, there's some ands buried in words like sand or strand. Yeah. And when you said that, it struck me how many of these poems seem to take place on beaches, the keel is striking the beach. And is there something about the beach, going back to Romanticism, why is the pluralist poem taking place on a beach or near a beach?
Discuss. Oh, I don't know. It's a very good thought. What do you think? I suppose a beach, to be absolutely naff about it, a beach is a liminal space. It is neither one thing nor another. It is neither sea nor land. So in a way you are between two elements in which you have to take a stand, I suppose.
Diversity is its strength.
Yes, it's a good point. Hadn't struck me. Yes, it's striking that the poem is called Dover Beach, and I know that Arnold has to fulfill a rhyme with the word land, but nevertheless, it's odd for him to say strand. He could have said beach. He wants to get and in the poem again, smuggled in under the cloak of strand. Anyway.
Do we have a final concluding question? Someone's pointing. Well, I can't see the. Oh, there. Sorry. Go on.
Thank you for your talk, Seamus. I had a question about selfhood and pluralism, because I think Empson is obviously thinking of Whitman when he talks about maintaining oneself between contradictions, and oneself is very interesting. So you started with William James. Could you please speak about that relationship? And maybe, as an American, could you talk about that particular inflection?
What, the idea of oneself so the unity of the self, you mean? Yeah. Well, I think the unity of the self is a little bit like the unity of the Jamesian universe. I mean, it's constantly challenged by the multiplicity that it is, as it were, containing. And Empson is completely, Empson has read lots of Freud. He knows all about conflicting aspects of the human self. And I think that he probably thinks, I don't know, I need to go away and think about it, or have a talk to Christopher Briggs about it or something. I think that he probably thinks that the unity of the self is a pragmatic thing rather than a metaphysical thing. That it's about how you compose yourself to engage in human interaction in a way that is significant and intelligent and emotionally successful. But I'm winging it, I confess.
By now, each of us is several. But Seamus is Seamus, and we are grateful to him for a wonderful talk. Thank you for coming. Thank you for coming to the previous lectures. Ladies and gentlemen, Seamus Perry.